In the summer of 2007, the city of Dnipropetrovsk in eastern Ukraine was a place of almost ordinary life. Factories ran, families moved through daily routines, students prepared for university. On the surface, nothing was wrong. But between June and July of that year, something was happening in the margins of that ordinary life. 21 people were killed. Most of them had no connection to each other. Most of them were strangers, chosen almost at random. The killers were not career criminals. They were not adults shaped by years of hardship or institutional violence. They were teenagers. 2 of them were 19 years old. 1 was just a year younger, and they filmed themselves doing it. This is not a story about monsters who appeared from nowhere. It is a story about how 3 young men decided, in cold blood and in concert, that human life was worth less than their own entertainment, and how that decision created one of the most disturbing criminal records in modern European history. Viktor Sayenko was born in 1988. By all accounts, he was bright, even academically capable. He had studied at a local technical institute. People who knew him described him as confident, sociable. Nothing in his early life marked him as someone capable of what was to come. Igor Suprunyuk was his closest friend. The two had grown up together in Dnipropetrovsk, a major industrial city on the Dnipro River, with a population of over 1 million people. Suprunyuk was quieter than Sayenko, more reserved, but equally involved in what would unfold. The third member of the group was Alexander Hanzha, 18 years old. He participated in several of the early attacks, but would later distance himself from the worst of the violence. His role in the case would become legally distinct from the other 2. None of them came from extreme poverty. None had documented histories of abuse or severe mental illness. Their families were ordinary. Their childhoods, by the standards of the region, were unremarkable. Investigators and psychologists who later studied the case struggled with a question that had no clean answer. Why? What prosecutors would eventually establish was that the killings were not motivated by money, by vengeance, or by any ideological cause. They were motivated in the most direct terms by the desire to film them. The 3 young men had acquired a mobile phone with a video camera, and they intended to use it. The first attacks began in the spring of 2007. The targets were selected without pattern: homeless men, elderly people, individuals who happened to be alone and vulnerable at the wrong moment. The attacks were carried out in public spaces, on the edges of parks and industrial areas, in the kinds of places where no one would be watching. The weapons were whatever was available: pipes, hammers, stones. The violence was extreme and deliberately prolonged. From the footage that investigators would later recover, it was clear that the acts were not performed in a rage or in a moment of uncontrolled aggression. They were methodical. The perpetrators spoke calmly during them. They observed what they were doing. Over the course of roughly 2 months, Sayenko and Suprunyuk killed 21 people. The victims ranged in age from a teenage boy to elderly men and women. Some were killed within minutes. Some were not. The footage recovered by police documented the full extent of what had been done. Investigators would later note that the group showed no signs of remorse during the killings and no signs of panic afterward. They returned to their regular lives. They went home. They went to school. They socialized. In at least one documented case, they filmed an attack and then reportedly went to a cafe. For the people of Dnipropetrovsk, the deaths at first appeared disconnected. A body found in a park. A man reported missing. The killings did not follow a recognizable pattern that would alert investigators to a single source. Each death looked at first like its own isolated tragedy. It was a mobile phone that broke the case open. not the one used to film the attacks, but one that had been stolen from a victim. Police traced the device and followed a chain of digital evidence that led them in July 2007 to Viktor Sayenko and Igor Suprunyuk. When authorities searched the suspects and their possessions, they recovered the footage. What they found was described by the Ukrainian prosecutors and investigators who reviewed it as unlike anything they had encountered in their careers. It was a recorded archive of 21 murders. The arrests came quickly after that. Sayenko and Suprunyuk were taken into custody. Alexander Hanzha was also arrested, though investigators determined his direct involvement was limited to a smaller number of the attacks. A fourth individual, identified in some records, was also questioned but later cleared of direct involvement in the killings. The interrogations that followed were extensive. Both Sayenko and Suprunyuk gave detailed accounts of what they had done. There was no attempt to deny the killings. The footage was, in a sense, a confession already on record. What the investigators pressed for, and what would occupy psychologists and criminologists for years afterward, was the question of motive. The answer, when it came, was brutally simple. They had wanted to film it. Some reports indicated the footage was intended to be sold or shared online. Others suggested the motive was less commercial and more purely gratuitous, that the filming itself was the point. Either way, the conclusion reached by the court and by those who studied the case was the same. The victims had died because 3 young men wanted a record of their deaths. At some point before the arrests, a portion of the footage leaked onto the early internet. It spread through file-sharing platforms and shock sites. It became known in the language of those spaces as the 3 Guys 1 Hammer. Video, a title that reduced an act of real murder to a piece of internet infamy. The clip circulated for years. Many people who encountered it did not know at first that what they were watching was real. When it became clear that it was, that the people in the footage were genuinely being killed, the reaction among those who had seen it ranged from horror to desensitization to something more troubling still. Law enforcement agencies in multiple countries became involved in attempts to remove the footage and trace its distribution. Some of it remains findable to this day, a fact that has never been fully resolved. The existence of the footage raised questions about the nature of online platforms, about what counts as documentation versus distribution of violence, and about the long aftermath suffered by the victims' families, who knew that recordings of their loved ones' deaths were accessible to anyone with an internet connection. The ethical weight of that reality is not a small one. The victims of Sayenko and Suprunyuk were killed twice, in a sense once on a riverbank in Ukraine, and once in the attention economy of the early internet. The trial of Viktor Sayenko and Igor Suprunyuk concluded in February 2009 at the Dnipropetrovsk Regional Court of Appeal. Both were found guilty on all charges. The court convicted them of 21 counts of premeditated murder with particular cruelty, a specific legal classification under Ukrainian law that reflected the nature of the acts. Both were sentenced to life imprisonment. Under Ukrainian law at the time, the death penalty had been abolished in 2000, meaning the maximum available sentence was a term of natural life. Neither Sayenko nor Suprunyuk showed visible emotion at sentencing, according to courtroom accounts. Alexander Hanzha, tried separately for his involvement in a smaller number of the attacks, received a lesser sentence. He was convicted and imprisoned, though for a shorter term. The families of the 21 victims attended portions of the proceedings. For many of them, the trial provided documentation, but not clarity. The question that the prosecution had answered was who had done this? The question that lingered for those left behind and for the psychologists who studied the case was one that the legal system is not designed to answer. How does a 19-year-old decide that this is something he will do? Viktor Sayenko and Igor Suprunyuk remain in prison in Ukraine. As of the last confirmed reports, neither has been released, and neither is eligible for parole under the terms of their conviction. The case has been studied in academic contexts, criminology, psychology, media studies, as an early and extreme example of what researchers call crime as performance. The idea that the documentation of violence changes its nature, that the presence of a recording device is not incidental but causal. Without the phone, the prosecution argued, the killings might not have happened in the same way or at all. That argument has not been definitively settled, but it remains one of the more uncomfortable questions the case leaves behind in an era when virtually every person carries a device capable of recording and transmitting anything. What does it mean when that capability becomes a motive rather than merely a method? The 21 people killed in Dnipropetrovsk in the summer of 2007 were not famous. They were not powerful. Most of them were among the most vulnerable people in the city. They deserve to be remembered, not as details in a story about their killers, but as individuals. People with histories, with families, with ordinary lives that ended suddenly and brutally for no reason that reflects anything about them. The horror of this case is not located in the footage or in the internet platforms that spread it. It lives in that gap between the ordinariness of a summer in a mid-sized Ukrainian city and the 21 people who did not make it.